AM 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, 24 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. I know very little, Robin.
Okay.
I know you don't like when I say that because you say, come on, Larry, you're a pretty smart guy. But the truth is, I believe a lot, but I know very little. Let me give you an example. So we had a guy on, he was talking about how the world was, gazillion years old, whatever. And then I had some pushback from some of our listeners saying, how come you didn't contest him? Everybody knows the world was made in 6 days and 7 days. Mm-hmm. I said, well, I don't know that. I mean, what I believe and what I know is two different things. And how would I even know? How would I even begin to know? And so many of the things that are embedded in us are we hold on to those things, whether they're customs or a belief about a fact or a belief about the way women are supposed to behave differently than men, or you know what I mean, or even people's preconceptions of you, because maybe in my case I'm from New York, therefore I must be a certain way, or I'm a talk show host, therefore I must be a certain way. And so a lot of that stuff is really unmovable. And I know people who don't budge. Well, why? Why don't they budge? Well, we have a guest who has looked at this for 20-something years. Yeah. She's got a book called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. And I think in the good sense, I'd like to believe that I'm a rule breaker. I do hope I am one of those people who I'm not bound at the mercy of whatever social restraints I'm supposed to be. Mm-hmm. And you know me, Robin, so that probably is true about me, right?
Yeah, you wrote a song about it.
Did I?
You rule makers, you rule breakers.
Did I write a song? Yeah. Michele Gelfand. Apparently I wrote a song like that. A distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, featured in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, NPR, Voice of America, Fox, The Economist. And again, the book is called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. And let me break some news. Maybe she doesn't even know this. This book is currently number 1 as the hardcover, number 2 as the Kindle, and number 3 as the audiobook.
Wow. It's only been out like 10 days. This is so amazing.
Yeah, I think it was released on the 11th, I think.
So this is amazing. Congratulations.
Let's find out about this book with you here. I don't know if I did a good job explaining what this book is about. Michele Gelfand. Good morning, Michele.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be on your program.
20 years you've been studying this. What happened 20 years ago that made you say, I want to figure this out?
Actually, it's so interesting. Life happened to me making other plans. And I was pre-med and I did a semester in London and I was pretty overwhelmed with the sights and sounds of London. So I called my dad. He's from Brooklyn. And I said, Dad, it's really weird. People travel from London to Paris just for the weekend or to the Netherlands. And he said, you know what? It's just like going from New York in his quintessential Brooklyn accent to Pennsylvania. And that metaphor gave me so much courage that literally the next day, I booked a trip to Egypt. And I said, Dad, it's just like going from New York to California. Don't worry about it. And he was upset about this. But, it was that journey that I took that I realized, I know nothing about the world. I know nothing about culture. And what was so profound is it's so invisible, but it's so powerful. And I sort of thought about that New Yorker, that sheltered Long Island kid who was looking at the world through that New Yorker cartoon, where you put a couple of rocks outside of the city and then the rest of the world. And I just realized I know nothing about myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pivot. So I went by and got a PhD in cross-cultural psychology, and the rest is history.
So you and I have that in common, where at one point we thought the whole world was right there in that little area called New York, Long Island. We thought that was everything. There was nothing else outside there, right? So
right. I have family that still thinks that way.
But what is it about? I don't think that's unusual, though. I think that happens here in this part of Florida. I think it happens probably all over the world. People who don't leave their geographical area figure their area is the world, right?
I think that's right. I mean, Herodotus was this ancient Greek philosopher, said all humans are ethnocentric. We sort of see the world, this is like thousands of years ago, through our own lens, and we actually think about that's the correct way to see the world. So I think that understanding the cultures challenges that. You start realizing, wow, the cultural differences arise from a reason. Like if I happen to be born in Singapore, maybe I'd be a very different person. And so that's what this book is about. is to help us understand culture, but also ourselves.
Okay, but there is one thing about New York that sort of gives New Yorkers a little bit of a difference, and that is that it's a melting pot. So while
right.
so you have a Jewish friend and a Catholic friend and a Muslim friend and black friends and white friends and Irish friends, and that in itself gives you a better maybe sense of respect, and you're not so necessarily dogmatic about your own what you were taught, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You know, all cultures have their advantages and disadvantages depending on your vantage point. And New York is a great example of a loose culture. In the book, I call these rule breakers. It's a culture that has a wide range of behavior that's permissible. You'll see people jaywalking all the place. You might see littering, dog waste. So loose cultures, including New York, including New Zealand or the Netherlands, they tend to have, a lot of permissiveness. But on the flip side, they tend to be pretty disorderly. Like tight cultures, which are cultures that are rule makers. They have a lot of rules. There's strict punishments. Think Singapore, think Germany, think Alabama. They have a lot of rules, but they're much more orderly. They have less crime. They're more synchronous. Even their clocks in their city streets say more likely to say the same time than in like loose cultures where you're not quite sure what time it is. But on the other side, tight cultures are orderly, but they're pretty ethnocentric and they have less tolerance. So, it's really a trade-off when you think about cultural differences. They each have their advantages and disadvantages depending on your vantage point.
And sometimes people within those cultures, they will intentionally promote a conflict because they don't know exactly how to accept a different culture.
I think that's right. Often we don't understand that these differences arise for a good reason. Like, for example, in my research, the groups that evolve to be tight, that have a lot of rules, they tend to have a lot of threat. So imagine you live in a place where there's constant invasions or there's a lot of natural disasters or there's food scarcity. Like, you need a lot of rules in those contexts to survive. And that's what my research has shown. I've studied population density in countries. If you have a lot of people that are all around you and you can't really go anywhere, you need rules to avoid chaos. And so once we understand that, well, tight cultures, they tend to evolve for good reasons. And loose cultures don't have as much threat, so they can afford to be more permissive. Those aren't the only reasons why they evolve. I mean, loose cultures have a lot of diversity, as you mentioned, Larry. They tend to have a lot of mobility where it's harder to agree upon norms, and they have more anonymity, so people feel less accountable. But nevertheless, cultural differences aren't random. They tend to evolve for a reason. And once we understand that, we can have more empathy.
Empathy, and I was wondering about respect. If you are in a culture, let's say, keep it in our own backyard. Let's say a guy is dating a girl, and she's been from her family's from a different background. And he goes over there, and they always ask for the salt. They don't just grab the salt. They ask, please pass the salt. Okay. I know it's a real simple one, right? And then he just goes to grab the salt, and she slaps his hand, right?
Yeah.
He's got to learn to respect the rules of that house, right?
Well, that's right. Now, actually, tight loose is really like all around us in a local level. So my husband comes from a pretty tight family background from the Midwest. I come from New York, Jewish family. Everyone's stealing the food off their plate.
You grab the salt, yeah.
On the table. I mean, this is normal. Like, you need to fight for your food. And so, once you understand that, well, we have kind of come from different worlds, you can negotiate those conflicts ahead of time. And I have students, I have colleagues who are constantly, even in their own marriages, they realize, wow, we're coming from a different tight and loose mindset. Whether it comes to finances or parenting is a biggie. Like, I actually constantly negotiating, like, what domains need to be tight and which could be looser when you're raising teenagers. It's something we can use, the power of social norms. We can use them to make our lives, more harmonious. And I think that's what this book really tries to get at, not just the national level, the state level, but also our everyday lives and how we can use culture to have better lives, basically.
And you have to be fluent in your communication abilities or else there's going to be a problem.
I think that's right. I think it's really starting to sit back and think about why am I like this? I mean, people have a different tight and loose mindset depending on their generational status, their social class, their culture, their gender. And once we realize, like, I have a tight loose mindset quiz actually on my website at michellegelfand.com that you can see, like, where do you score on the tight loose mindset? Do you veer tight? Do you veer loose? Maybe think about how this is affecting conflict in your everyday life at your Thanksgiving dinner tables with your in-laws or with your kids, or and then how can we kind of step back and negotiate some of these differences? It's exciting to kind of think about that you can do something about it.
I'm curious if your study and the book itself, does it help us embrace people with differences better if we understand that those differences don't necessarily threaten us?
I think that that's right. I think once we start confronting people who we feel threaten us, we realize we're so much more similar than we are different. I did a study that I talked about in the book with U.S. Students and Pakistani students that really had extreme stereotypes about each other. Pakistani students thought Americans were loose, but they also thought they were exceedingly loose. They were running around half naked. They were drinking all the time. They were calling the police on their parents.
That sounds fun.
I miss out on everything.
But Americans had really extreme stereotypes also. That they thought of Pakistanis being overly strict. They didn't think about them reading poetry or playing sports. And we did a very, simple intervention. We had Americans read daily diaries from Pakistanis for a week. We had Pakistanis read daily diaries from Americans. These are unedited diaries. And it was really amazing to see by the end of the study how much they reduced their stereotypes, how much they saw, wow, like they're different, but they're not as nearly as different as we thought they were. They're so much more similar.
That's why I think
it was exciting to see that.
That's why I think maybe young people are the answer to the world's problems. Young people using social media, because if they're posting, oh my gosh, I don't want to go to school today, and then some Palestinian kid is saying, oh my God, that's the way I think too, and the Israeli kid is thinking, oh, I don't want to go to school either. They realize there's a lot of similarities, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think that the problem is that we tend to stay in our own echo chambers. We thought that globalization was going to make us talk to each other more. But reality is when you look at, kind of communication trends, you don't see people getting us out of their box. We have to actively say, let's go and learn about other people. Let's challenge our stereotypes. And again, that helps you learn about yourself, like where you're coming from. If you were accidentally born in Singapore, for example, you might support the fact that you're not allowed to bring large quantities of gum in the country. That sounds really kind of strange. Why an American would say, that's crazy. Why can't you chew gum in Singapore without a doctor's prescription? Right. And it turns out that, Singapore is 20,000 people per square mile. So it's really packed in. It's like living in an elevator. And apparently people were chewing gum and putting it on the floor, and it was causing, all sorts of problems with trains and elevators. So Lee Kuan Yew just said, guys, you know what? We're going to have to ban gum because this is causing a major problem. And people at first were upset about this, but then they thought, this is actually a really important rule. Once we get outside of our comfort zones and we learn why the cultures solve the problems they need to solve in the way they do, we can really be more understanding and realize it's a historical accident that maybe you were born in Gainesville or I was born in Long Island. We've been so profoundly shaped by our environments, and it's so invisible culture that it's really hard to see it. It's like two fish in the water swimming, and one fish says, how's the water? And the fish are like, what the heck is water? They don't even realize they're swimming in water.
Oh, yeah.
And we don't realize culture.
Where diversity seems to be very, very beneficial, at least in our community. We have a Habitat for Humanity. And when Habitat for Humanity has these house builds, people from different monetary backgrounds, different religious beliefs, we all come together and build this house. Well, we don't know where in the monetary scale they sit or what they believe in and stuff, and everybody seems to get along. But then you've got people that all of a sudden, when they're not in that situation, they'll see a group of people and maybe say, oh, I don't like them because of what they believe.
Right. I think
or money.
Once you come together, you start realizing, like I said, you're more similar than we're different. I have a whole chapter in the book on social class because I think it's, again, something we totally misunderstand. It's usually we think about that in terms of bank accounts, but in fact, we all live in different cultural worlds depending on our social class. And my research shows that the working class has a lot of rules, and they need rules because they're avoiding lots of threats like poverty or avoiding getting killed on the job to keep them more dangerous. And so it's really clear that once we step back, we could see these differences really have a logic. We have to have more empathy and understanding for our cultural differences. And then we can get along much better once we do.
The book, again, is called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. It is written by our guest, Michele Gelfand. It's a #1 book. It's a #2 Kindle. It's a #3 audio book. Oh my gosh, that's exciting. Did you realize that it was up, that it was doing so well?
Actually, I didn't, because I'm actually taking my daughter, who's a high school senior, on a college tour. So
oh my!
I really? I was on Morning Joe yesterday, so I was on Morning Joe, and that was exciting to be in New York City. I was back at home. My dad in Brooklyn is watching this show, and and he's a snowbird. So I'm really a big fan of Florida. We try to get down to Florida as much as humanly possible because we love it.
If he was watching you right now, he would see the cover of your book.
Yeah,
on live.
on our podcast. Yeah, we
Yeah.
have the cover of your book. All right.
Awesome.
You mentioned something earlier about it's kind of a survival thing, the rules, and I've often thought sometimes, because I kind of hinted earlier that I've always been a little bit on the rebellious side. I guess the older I get, the less I do that. But in adhering to the rules reluctantly, for my own benefit, sometimes I would adhere to the rules because I looked at life in a way as a game. You know, it's like you can't really fight the banks if you have to do this, that, and the other thing in order to get a loan, then you better do those things because it's a game and here are the rules. It almost makes the rules almost make it easy because it's kind of right. laid out for you, right?
Yeah, I think you just hit on a really important point. You know, we as humans are an ultra normative species. Like we develop norms and rules to help us coordinate in an unbelievable way and cooperate. You know, we're following rules from the moment we get up to the morning and go to sleep. Like I'm sure you guys are wearing clothing right now. Like that's a rule that we developed. You know,
I had a look. I wasn't sure.
We ride on the right side of the street or the left side of the street effortlessly. We don't face the elevator backwards and start pushing all the buttons. Some of us don't. You know, we don't sing in libraries. I try to make myself do these things just to see what the reaction is. And we're following rules all the time because if we didn't, we couldn't coordinate. It would be so unpredictable to be able to operate at the large scale. And I think from an evolutionary point of view, it's like incredible what we've accomplished because we follow rules. Now, at the extreme end, though, we have to think about when we get too extreme, when we start following rules blindly, or we have no rules, they each have their own disadvantages. And even companies struggle with this. For example, I wrote an op-ed on United. I mean, as a company, they need a lot of rules. We don't want airlines doing all sorts of weird things and having a lot of discretion because it's a lot of safety issues. Same with surgical teams. But at the same time, like those cultures can get too tight and they need to loosen up. They need to introduce some discretion into them. Or at the flip side, you think about companies that are getting too loose. Tesla might be a good example of that. I mean, the guy's a creative genius, Elon Musk, but at the same time, they need to inject a little more structure into the production, a little more tightness. So I call this the Goldilocks principle. You know, we all veer tight or loose, but once we get too extreme, we need to start thinking mindfully, how do we tighten up or how do we loosen? That applies to companies, to nations, to households. So I think it's something, norms we developed and we need them and we can also use them and calibrate them as we need to.
Well, politicians should read your book because it seems like every time those elected officials make rules, it's to better their monetary status or do what's the in it for me thing and not for what their constituents want.
I think it's a great point because, you know, the fact is that people who have more power or higher status, they live in looser worlds. That's something I talk about in the book. Whereas people who are lower social power status, women, minorities, and all sorts of other identities live in tighter worlds. They have to abide by more rules. So I think, you know, one of the things we need for high power people is more accountability, that they, you know, once you have monitoring and accountability, then you have less of those violations. And that's something I talk about quite a lot in the book. The other thing I mentioned, I think is really interesting, and I talk about this book a lot, is how politicians they're almost like good cultural psychologists. Some of them are using threat, they're activating threat in order to tighten groups. Because we know that this is a basic evolutionary principle. When there's threat, groups want strong rules and they want strong leaders to help them cope and survive. And that really makes a lot of sense. We need that when we have objective threat.
Yeah,
but we don't need that when we have subjective or illusory threat. So sometimes we can tighten up unnecessarily by our own leaders. And it's something that is happening all around the world that is important because when you have increased tightness, you have increased order, but you have less tolerance. And that's the trade-off that we have to deal with, and less creativity.
I think you're right.
I think that it's something that, you know, it comes also from the top down with leaders who are using the threat to tighten up groups all around the world.
I think you've hit on the reason for wars right there. I mean, that's a very profound observation that you just made. I wanted to ask you about 17 years old or 16 years old. When we're that age, we are doing things that intentionally break the rules. We do this broadcast from the local shopping mall, and we have a window, and we can see kids going into the mall. And the one thing we comment on a lot is the ripped jeans and the droopy drawers. Now that's clearly breaking some rules, but maybe that's just their way of saying, okay, I'm not going to follow your rules because I'm getting ready to be an adult and I'm moving into the world. What do you think?
I think that, it's interesting, like even as far back as Plato, the philosopher, he was saying, look at this younger generation. Oh my God, like they're so loose, basically. I think every generation says that a little bit, but you have a really good point. Like it manifests itself differently. And, I just went shopping with my 2 teenagers and like I had to just, capitulate. I might get those ridiculous jeans that have all these holes in it. But, this is where I think we need to be mindful of, okay, not every domain has to be tight. In my household, I'm like, look, you need to be, working hard in school. You need to be nice to each other as siblings. But I can give up a little bit of, kind of strictness in terms of those kind of appearance types of things. Because, I think as parents, parenting is very threatening context. And I think our inclination is to tighten up in every possible domain. In fact, another domain much to my husband's dismay, that I allow to be loose is their rooms and how sloppy they are. I'm like, all right, just be a slob. That's fine with me. As long as these other domains, you're being tight in, and they know where the punishments will come. They know where I'm strict, and it's not in every domain, including those ripped jeans.
Tell me about on the Amazon page. It talks about people driving. I think it was Jaguars are more likely to run a red light. Women in New Zealand are more likely to have a lot of sex partners.
Oh, there you go.
In Germany, the clocks are more likely to be right than they are in Brazil. What is that about? How did you figure all that out?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We did a study that was published in Science some years ago where we got, sort of assessed the levels of tightness. You can think about it as a continuum. Like, we all have rules, but some groups have stronger rules than others. And in our data, we also we gathered some other research that was looking at accuracy of city clocks. And it was very clear that when you go to Greece or Brazil, which are quite loose in our data, the clocks say very different times. So you're not quite sure what time it is. It's more coordinated, and same with in terms of the sex partners. I mean, I think there's a lot more permissiveness in loose cultures that goes along with that tolerance that you're talking about. You're exposed to a lot of different people. There's much more tolerance from legalized prostitution to protests. And New Zealand's also one of the countries that has its own nominated national wizard, and his job is to basically entertain the country.
Wow.
Then you take a short trip, over to Singapore, which has had a lot of threat in its life in terms of population density, in terms of conflict, in terms of disasters, and they have many more rules. They're called the fine country, meaning like you can get fined for a lot of things. But at the flip side, those places are really orderly. I mean, I told my kids, if you don't behave, we're moving to Singapore because there's very low crime and it's really clean and really orderly. Japan, it's really funny. There's a Wait, Don't Tell Me show where they were saying, what do Japanese police officers need more of? And we're all guessing maybe it's more vacation time, more pay. Turns out Japanese policemen need more crime because there's so little crime in Japan. So they're starting to egg people on to do some crime. So that's, kind of the trade-off. I'd see it as like the order versus openness. And tight cultures have a lot of the former, and loose cultures have more of the latter.
This is a very revealing study that you've shared with us, Michele. I love this. I have a copy of the book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. Call me if you want the one that was sent to us. I'll buy my own. I found it on Amazon where you're doing really, really well. You're number 1, number 2, and number 3, which is not too bad. Everybody else is jealous right now. So do you have a website dedicated to your work?
I do. It's Michele with 1 L. Gelfand, GELFAND.com. And, I have the Tight Loose Mindset quiz on the website. I have other excerpts on the website to read a little about the book. And then I have all my original research that the book is based on, because that's the exciting thing. I've been spending, 2 decades just to kind of really get a lot of research done on this so that it's grounded in science. But I hope the book is really accessible, and there's a lot of stories in there. And so I hope that, your audience will enjoy it.
Michele, we have definitely enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for being on the air with us. Good luck with the book, and come back with the next one.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. We will be right back.
Fox News Radio. I'm Chris Foster. President Trump says about the sexual assault claim against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh.
Why didn't somebody call the FBI 36 years ago? I mean, you could also say, when did this all happen? What's going on?
The president with Fox's Sean Hannity last night, he tweeted something similar this morning, adding, I have no doubt that if the attack on Dr. Ford was as bad